Well, welcome to this special program that we're doing on Why We Write. We're here with Dr. Henry Aldridge, Professor Emeritus of the Eastern Michigan University. He was very instrumental in setting up the media program here at Eastern and developing many of the classes that we now take for granted, the film appreciation classes, television production, radio production. Does anyone do radio anymore?
No, they don't. No, they really do. Yeah, they do. Sure.
Of course they do.
Of course they do.
It's a different place. But we're here to talk today about this Michigan theater history book that you wrote, and it was published in 2013. And I'm very proud of it. I'm the executive director of the Michigan Theater, so it's a great honor to do this with you and talk about the Michigan Theater and about the process of creating this book. Now, if I understand, you started your work on the Michigan Theater when you first came to town in 1970.
Yes.
But you had worked on and become fascinated with theater organs. The Michigan Theater is a 1928 movie palace, and silent-era movie palaces had organs, pipe organs installed in them to provide the accompaniment. And you actually first got interested in pipe organs back in Tennessee, where you're from.
Yeah, indeed. That's exactly right. My interest in theater organs and old movie theaters started in my hometown of Chattanooga, Tennessee. We had a lovely movie theater there called the Tivoli, which is right downtown on Main Street. It's a wrap and wrap house of about 1,800 seats, and I went there as a child all the time. The theater was going to be torn down, but it was then bought by the city, so it was preserved. And I remember as a child, my grandmother and I would go to the movies, and she would say, "Whatever happened to the organ at the Tivoli Theater?"
And this would have been in the 1950s,
1950s. And I would look around and I'd say to myself, I don't see any evidence of a pipe organ in this building. So it was logged in
that was odd. It was odd to think about a pipe organ in a theater in the 1950s and 60s.
Absolutely. It made no sense to me,
Right.
and I thought I had no understanding of why it would be there or where it was. But it was
organs are in churches, typically.
churches,
roller rinks,
radio studios,
dance
halls, all of those things. But to a child, this idea of having a sleeping pipe organ in an old movie theater was very fascinating, and I also logged in my 10,000 hours of going to movies as a child,
which is what you need to create minimum competency.
That's exactly right.
People,
so
yes.
I not only had an interest in old movie theaters, but I saw a lot of movies, and on the side was the back of my mind, these old theaters had pipe organs in them. So go forward to 1963.
And of course, seriously, the curious mind that you had, you tried to fit those things together and figure out why that made sense.
Yeah, and it didn't dawn on me until winter of 1963. I was taking a wonderful course at the University of North Carolina. It was a criticism and reviewing course, and
on cinema.
No, it was on actually it was on books and movies,
kind of literary
and plays, and every week we got an assignment to do a different kind of review. So this particular week, in the middle of the semester, we were to pick a nonfiction book to write a review of. So I went down to the local bookstore. This is long before Borders and Barnes and Noble. Went down to the bookstore in Chapel Hill, and on the table of new arrivals was this book called The Best Remaining Seats. A guy named Ben M. Hall, who was a writer for Time magazine and Life magazine as well. And so I bought the book and read it, and it was all about old movie theaters. And there was a chapter in there about pipe organs. And I thought, oh, that's what my grandmother was talking about. There's a whole chapter on these strange things called theater organs. So I wrote the review.
And that book was a lot about New York theaters in particular, like Radio City Music Hall and the Roxy Theater and the Paramount.
Right. The reason Ben wrote that book was because he was working in the Time Life building, which is on Avenue. No, it's on Avenue of the Americas. Okay. It's right up across from Radio City. Yeah. He could look out his back window and see them tearing down the Roxy, which was over on the next street over. And so he decided to write a book to sort of memorialize the departure of the Roxy, which was probably the greatest of the movie palaces.
Yeah, 6,000 seats,
6,000
built in 1927, I think.
1927.
Yeah.
So at any rate, I read this book and thought, oh, okay, so that's what they mean about theater organs. And so I logged that in the back of my head, and the very next weekend, my girlfriend and I went to the movies at the Center Theater in Durham, North Carolina. And we walked into the theater, and I thought, I wonder if they have an organ. And sure enough, down front, I could see the little console, the little white console of the organ.
The console's where the keyboards
Yeah,
are. Right?
yeah. That's about half of the organ. The rest of it's hidden away.
Right.
So at any rate, I asked the manager about it, and the manager said, yes, as a matter of fact, it's been restored, and there's going to be a concert on it the following Saturday night. So I went to the concert, and I heard first time a theater organ, which sounds very different from a church organ. It's a very romantic kind of sound. And so all the pieces came together. With my grandmother's original statement, the book,
Your
and
research,
here
and
there
then,
was one.
Yeah.
And so I met the guy who was playing the instrument, and he offered to give me lessons. And so I started playing in 1963, and was so interested in that I got interested in the history of movie theaters and film history, and that led me to changing my academic fields from English literature to radio, television, film.
And thus a career was born.
And thus a career was born. Came to University of Michigan in 1970 for the PhD program in radio, TV, film, and I knew that there was a place called the Michigan Theater, which you know very well.
Okay, yes, I do.
And sitting down in the orchestra pit at the theater was a slumbering pipe organ. And I knew about that. I knew it was there. So the second day I was in Ann Arbor, I went down to the Michigan Theater, went in, asked the manager if I could play the organ. He says, sure, go ahead. Doesn't work very well, but go ahead. That led to the whole thing.
Well, we're going to take a little break right now, and in the second, well, we're not going to take a little break right now. We're going to keep it going here.
Okay.
Very interesting story about how you got engaged in historic theaters and their historic theater organs. And I know from talking to you in the past that Ben Hall's book, The Best Remaining Seats, was a real inspiration in very, very many ways.
Yes.
And it's clear that with this book, your book on the Michigan Theater, that there was an inspiration, and you had the opportunity to focus on one particular movie palace that was built the same year that the Roxy opened, 1927, and Michigan Theater opened a few days into 1928.
Right.
And why don't you tell us, one, what the process you went through to research the book?
Sure.
Because I know that there was a lot of formal research, but there was also a lot of just informal experience that you had,
sure.
And collecting of stories, and then the kind of mechanics of actually writing the book. So when did you first start researching the Michigan Theater just on an informal basis?
I think it probably started around 1980. And it started in this way. We introduced a film history course here at Eastern. And after teaching it for a couple of years, I thought my students need to have some experience in doing what I would call primary research, going back to the original documents, but trying to understand
programs, newspapers, those kind of
programs,
things,
artifacts, to understand where the information comes from, textbooks used to construct their narrative of film history. So I was thinking, how do we do this? What kind of project can I give them? And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to have a list of everything that ever ran at the Michigan Theater from 1928 to the present? So I devised this little torture test for my students, which was I assigned each one of them 2 years, from 1928 to then 1980 or so, and sent them off to the grad library at the University of Michigan, to the microfilm collection. And there they sat and slowly ground through the microfilms of the Ann Arbor News. And for each week, I didn't make them do it every day, but for each week I had them write down the change of bill at the Michigan Theater.
So you had them record what movie was playing,
Right.
if there was a live vaudeville act,
Yes.
what was playing,
Right.
Who the organist was, if
Right.
that was possible, what short films might, because
Yeah.
it had lots of different components to it.
Yes, and so they wrote down as much as the display ad would tell them, and then they would go on to the next week.
And that was week after week,
week after week after
for,
week. So
for 60 years or 70
yeah,
years.
Yeah, and that formed the basis for really a kind of a database, as it were, for doing this book. And what we did before we ever started really writing the book was to have a student in the historic preservation program at Eastern take all these documents, these ring binders stacked somewhere in the basement of the Michigan Theater, and getting all of that information transferred to a searchable database. So I could go to December 1935 very quickly and see what was playing the third week in November, let us say, which would have been an important holiday weekend. So that was the basis for all that.
Yeah, and that's great. What a great resource that is. Well, now
Absolutely.
We're going to take a little bit of a break, and we'll come back and talk about the process of creating the book and all of the documentation that you went through. So we're going to come back in just a minute with Why We Write.
Pterosaurs are often called pterodactyls because of the structure of their wing. Pterodactyl, in fact, means winged finger, and the wing did indeed consist solely of a large finger. Pterosaurs was enormously large. A membrane of skin extended from the tip of this finger to either the side of the body or the hind limb.
So now it's midterms, and you seem to be missing some steps between the evolution of winged mammals and the first shuttle? Easier said than done, you say? Well, for starters, try and get down the main points. Then if you have time, examples. Abbreviate frequently used names. Make Martin Luther King. Oedipus Rex can be. Places. Abbreviate any frequently used words. You're also more likely to retain the material if you review your notes as soon as possible and recopy them so they're more legible, highlighting the high points.
You're an individualist, a person who can stand against all adversity.
But your grades suck.
Group study.
The best way to learn is to try and teach someone else. And when you study with someone else, you can compare notes and better determine what will be on the test. You can use the quiz bowl method.
What's the airspeed velocity of a laden English swallow?
There's safety in numbers.
If there's a problem you all have on a test, you can go to the professor as a group.
And always, try and study with people who are stronger students than yourself.
We're talking to Dr. Henry Aldridge about his book about the Michigan Theater in Ann Arbor. You told us a little bit of background of what fascinated you and got you interested in television media arts to begin with, what your background was in terms of learning how to play the theater organ, learning about historic theaters, getting a doctorate in media arts studies, with a particular interest in theatrical exhibition. Your students at Eastern, starting in the mid-70s, I guess, started helping with research, which was part of their class exercise, and that was kind of informal. And then a few years ago, you and I talked about the fact that it might be a good idea if you actually put down all of your thoughts and history and background and really create a book about the Michigan Theater, which is a book about the Michigan Theater, but it's also a book about theatrical movie exhibition and movie palaces as they evolved in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and then in the modern era, the post commercial use of those theaters in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. So tell us about the formal research that you did to put this book together. When did you start? What did it take? And I know I delayed you for several years.
Yeah, you did.
publishing of it?
I think it started about 7 years ago when you and I had the conversation, and I decided it was time to actually get going on it. And thanks to the generosity of the Michigan Theater Foundation and the department, I was given a little time to work on the project.
Yeah, it really was a village that created
it.
This
It was. Oh,
Eastern
absolutely. You don't do it by yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so we, the first step was taking what I call the Michigan Theater Calendar Project and converting that to a searchable database. So we had access to a pretty accurate sense of what ran at the theater from 1928 on. The next thing I did was to set up a series of interviews with as many people as I could think of, and I did miss a few, but I got a lot of people together and we started talking about what they remembered about the Michigan Theater. And most of those people went back into the early 70s. Some came a little bit later. Before that, it was pretty hard to get people who were still around who remembered the early history of the theater. So from about 1970, 75 on, we had real lasses, and I used a lot of their reminiscences as a place to start. For the early history of the Michigan Theater, I turned to the Bentley Historical Library.
Wonderful resource.
Wonderful
for anyone
resource.
Who wants to do research about anything in Michigan, pretty
Absolutely. So many of the photographs that that are found in the first 4 or 5 chapters of the book come from there. We also used articles in the Ann Arbor News, and here's what
that was again part of your students' research in a sense, right?
Well, I used the students' research to get me to look in specific places. I'll give you an example. In June of 1929, the Michigan Theater underwent a major change. It shifted from silent films to talking films. And I thought, that's worth looking more closely at. So the database told me the date, and so I went back to the Ann Arbor News, I started reading the articles that were related to it. So the database guided me to larger bodies of information. Another example is the State Theater opened in March of 1942. Yes. Yeah. And so I could go to that date and look up the Ann Arbor News. Was literally full of articles about the State Theater.
Yeah, they used to do that. But back when the Michigan Theater opened in the 20s and in the 40s, there was a whole section dedicated to the opening of those 2 grand.
It was a big deal, and the managers of the theaters were well known in the community, like you are today. But we don't think about commercial movie theater managers as being prominent citizens in the community.
Well, and Jerry Hogue.
Jerry Hogue was in Rotary. Everybody knew Jerry.
And he managed the Michigan Theater for almost a half a century.
He did.
And you actually knew him from your working with the organ back in the early 70s.
I did. Jerry just ending his career when I came to Ann Arbor in 1970. He worked until 1974 or 5, somewhere in there. I remember him very well. He was sort of your a wonderful example of your typical movie theater manager. So he was always in the lobby or standing out front. And if you ran into the lobby, he'd say, "Excuse me, young man, go back to the front door and walk in slowly." So, which is almost never done. So anyway, back to your question. So I used the Bentley Historical Library. I used interviews. I used additional information from the Ann Arbor News. And then we have an archive at the Michigan Theater. And once the Michigan Theater Foundation took over in September of 1979, we have the minutes of the Michigan Theater Foundation meetings, which were very interesting and it's a bit confusing because someone like the executive director would have a wonderful idea, which was mentioned in, let's say, November of 1984, but by January of 1985, that idea had completely disappeared.
Right.
So I often would turn to you, actually, for clarification about what happened to that wild and crazy idea of adding 20 screens to the Michigan Theater. So it came from a variety of different sources. And New York Times and other places to get the background.
Yeah, you put the Michigan Theater in context.
Yeah, and it's a very important. Yeah, that's a very important thing that I try to accomplish in the book. The Michigan Theater is a case study of what happened to one movie theater
where the Movie Palace came from in terms of its origins,
Right.
And then also how it fit into the local community, what other theaters opened,
Exactly.
how those reflected the times and
Right.
the business patterns. It's
and
really
how
very
that,
good.
and how that all fit into the national pattern, the timeline of what happened to movie theaters. And
when cinemalls started replacing single-screen
all
movie
that.
theaters and
Sure.
all of that. So that is a very interesting piece, and both how that national business trend was articulated locally in terms of the
Right.
theater building and that
Right.
kind of stuff, and all of that contextual thing. It's not just a list of facts.
Right.
And one of the
Right.
things that I find fascinating in general, just about why we write or how we write a book, is that it's not just a list of facts. Essentially, it's a collection of stories.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it's a collection of stories about individuals like
Right.
Jerry Hogue,
Right.
who was a fascinating guy in terms of his local
Sure.
position.
Sure.
It's fascinating about various aspects of the theater, like the musical and theatrics in addition to the movies that were there, how the students interacted with the theater and with theaters in general. A very interesting story there.
Sure.
And then the story about how the theater was saved, which revolves a lot around the organ and the individuals, the volunteers that coalesced around that particular movement, and then the development of the theater. So it's a really, I'm fascinated by how you knitted together those stories, both in terms of historical context outside of Washtenaw County, the historical context inside of Washtenaw
Right.
County, and how all of those pieces fit together to create this history. And it's, you know, it's the book's not this thick. The book is this thick. It's a
Yeah.
very, very well put together piece, and I'm fascinated by how you did that.
Well, it was a story that needed to be told. I mean, this is a story of historic preservation, a very good example of that, and community, individuals in the community rallying to do something about this theater, and how it turned out, how it moved from, let's say, a volunteer organization to a professional one, thanks to you. And it's been a remarkable success. And you go to the Michigan Theater today and you think, wow, isn't this wonderful that it worked out? But where would we be without the Michigan Theater? Can you imagine Ann Arbor without the Michigan Theater? So,
And there was definitely a day where that was a distinct possibility.
I was there the day it closed, and we thought, what have we done? You know, will this work? Will it not? And it did work out. And in some communities, it doesn't.
Correct. And you can't save every movie palace, but
No.
the story how this was saved, how you as someone, as a volunteer who was working on the organ, and then as a volunteer who committed to actually manage the theater for a period of time.
Sure, for 2 years.
No pay, just
Right.
passion.
Right.
There's a couple that I know that runs an arts consulting business, and they talk about how passion bends reality. And it's very clear from the story that you tell in this book that passion bent reality several times. The passion of Jerry Hogue in terms of how the theater developed and remained current, the passion of the volunteers that saved it, and then the passion of essentially the current staff that's developed it. So,
And in almost every one of these cases, there has to be a lot of passion, usually from one person. For example, Jackie Kennedy was the passion behind Grand Central Station. There was a Rockette who pushed saving Radio City Music Hall. There were similar people at the Michigan. The Orchestra Hall in Detroit was saved by, I think it was an oboe player, if I'm not sure, in the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. So there has to be somebody who really, really cares, and they can rally other people and get them going. And one of the things that was missing was a passionate person to save Pennsylvania Station in New York. And the historical preservation movement really got started when that station went down. Yeah. The citizens of New York said, how can this be that this gorgeous train station is being leveled to make room for an ugly Madison Square Garden? And
well, and those kind of things are referred to in this book in terms of that context of what moves things forward. The Roxy Theater being torn down, the Penn Station being torn down. And it's funny how those kind of national things can also have a local impact. And the Michigan Theater is an example of that. And how yourself, both as the author of the book and one of the passionate people that helped save the theater, the then mayor back in the late 1970s, Lou Belcher,
Right.
and a wonderful philanthropist by the name of Margaret Towsley. If it hadn't have been for you,
Absolutely.
and that
That's
story,
right.
again, you wrote the book, but the story is there, and folks know about it. Well, we're running down to the last minute or so of the show, and so let's talk about how this. You wrote it. You spent months and months and months and months, literally, locked in a room at various points in time, writing. And then there's some other folks that came to the fore that helped put the book in its final condition. There was
Yes.
an editor by the name of
Domenica Trevor
Yep.
was the editor. She took a rambling text and reduced it down and reshuffled some things and clarified some of my grammar. And one of the most important things she did was she took a lot of the factual information and moved it, long quotes, for example, and moved it to footnotes. So the text reads better. I put in everything I could think of. And so she moved some of that information to footnotes so that if you really want to know exactly who was playing the organ that day, let's say, you can find
there.
It's there, but it's removed from the main body of the text.
And it's amazing what a difference that made. And then just in terms of pointing it out, creating that kind of objective eye that
Absolutely.
didn't know the story per se, but
Right.
was able to read it and take your very good work and help make it more readable. And then a guy by the name of Marty Somberg.
Marty Somberg
designed it.
He designed the book, absolutely, which is a much more complicated task than I had ever imagined. We had to get high-resolution photographs for everything. And
he was a slave driver.
He was great.
We understand a little bit of why you wrote this book, and we thank you for doing it. And also that it literally does take a group of people, a village, to do anything.
Right.
To open the theater, to run the theater, to save the theater, and in this case, to actually write about it and put it in the context of our culture and our community. So thank you, Dr. Aldridge, Henry Aldridge. We're very happy that you could share this book with us, and we'll look forward to the next adventure that you have for us.
Thank you. Hey, Rusty.
Well,